Vietnam Conflict, Not a War. American History Project by Renee Ellis and Cia Smith. April 22nd, 2016. Narrated by Renee Ellis. Ask anyone from 1955 to 1975 about the fighting in Vietnam, and you will hear that war this or that war that. However, review the history books or media sources, and you will learn that the fighting that spanned across North and South Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos was never declared a war. As you will note from our video, the conflict in Vietnam had lots of hostile armed warfare. Because Congress never declared war on North Vietnam, they claimed their involvement was merely at the request of the South Vietnamese to aid them to avoid communist takeover from the Viet Cong and the Soviet Union. In 1961, there was a noted 23,000 U.S. advisors already in Vietnam. It was not until 1965, at the request of their allies, that U.S. troops actually put combat troops on the ground. Overall, there was more than 1.5 million troops in the United States, Vietnam, and Korea that fought the span of 19 years and 4 months in the jungles of Vietnam. Because the United States did not succeed in a military victory and Vietnam was defeated by the North, this conflict has been declared the only war America lost. The terrain in Vietnam created several challenges for the American troops, not just the climate, but the jungles. Walking through the tall grass and streams could lead to serious injury or disease. Military uniforms and fatigues were made of lightweight materials and were expected to dry quick. However, during monsoon season or on hot, humid days, their clothes were soaked and they felt like weights. The soldiers had to choose between clothes, food, water, and other rations as to what was most important. The weight of their rucksack presented a huge factor in how they maneuvered across the jungle. Personal hygiene suffered the most. It was not reasonable to think that things like washing your face, hands, and hair would be a daily event. There were fire bases set up along the rugged terrain, and troops were allowed to spend a short 2 or 3 days at base before returning to the jungle. Most jungle tours lasted about a month for each soldier. As if the terrain and climate weren't bad enough, the jungle environment lent itself to the enemy as a means of combat. Many U.S. troops lost their lives to booby traps such as the punji, a pit covered in grass where a soldier would step on it, fall onto spikes that covered with poison and dirt, and usually caused serious injury, if not death. There were tunnels covering approximately 50 square feet of the jungle. These tunnels were designed to help the Viet Cong and the U.S. troops hide their movements. The Viet Cong knew how to create trapdoors or entrances where the floor would collapse and again, a soldier would fall onto the spikes and be injured or killed. Many of these tunnels would go down 20 plus feet and house several soldiers. The tunnels held hospitals, shelters, and storage. It was very difficult for American troops to track the Viet Cong because of these tunnels, and this enabled the enemy to carry out hit and run attacks on the Americans. Although the U.S. struggled on the ground with this conflict, they were very strong in technology and combat. The type of search and destroy mentality made the U.S. military a force to be reckoned with. The use of planes that dropped bombs and chemical warfare was just one of the many tactics used by the U.S. The use of Agent Orange, a chemical substance that American pilots dropped on the Vietnamese jungles to kill vegetation, was a huge success because it exposed the Viet Cong, who had been hiding out in the tall grasses of the jungle. Agent Orange has since been linked to many medical problems such as cancer and birth defects by those who were exposed during the conflict. It was not until 1991 that the U.S. government recognized its links to health problems and began compensating veterans who were exposed. Another dangerous and extremely effective chemical weapon used by the U.S. was napalm. The jelly-like substance was dropped by American piloted planes When it made contact with the skin, it burned uncontrollably and nothing could be done. Chemical weapons were stored and stockpiled among various areas throughout the United States. There was a huge political impact on the Vietnam conflict. Under the Kennedy presidency, the assassination of Diem created a huge shift. Although Kennedy did not give the order to assassinate or eliminate Diem, he was noted to have written a letter to the U.S. ambassador of South Vietnam commending him on a job well done. Days later, after the Kennedy assassination, President Johnson declared, "The battle against communism must be met with strength and determination." It was during his tenure in office that the American people began to distrust the U.S. government related to the success on the efforts in Vietnam. Military leaders were attempting to control media coverages and patrol that there was U.S. progress. However, the South Vietnamese government was quickly deteriorating. Johnson's political ratings slumped due to his misleading comments and his refusal to send more troops. Johnson declined to run for a second term. Succeeding President Johnson was President Richard Nixon. President Nixon was very vocal during his campaign on the battles and lives lost in Vietnam. His political campaign was built around the Vietnamization policy. He vowed to remove the troops in Vietnam. But behind the scenes, he was being very aggressive and provoking with the Chinese and Soviet Union because of their continued support of North Vietnam. Support of conflict eroded, and protesters began coming out in droves. As things seemed to escalate in Vietnam, so did the protests back home. Anti-war rallies were showing up everywhere. Although the anti-war activists spoke of peace and love, many of their protests ended with the spitting, rock throwing, and violence. The mandated draft continued, sending 40-plus young Americans to serve each month. Mounting anguish compressed many protesters, and most felt this brutal conflict was costing American lives, as well as billions in taxpayer dollars. One of the most recognized and remembered protests was the Kent State protest. On May 1st, students had gathered on the campus of Kent State. They were protesting the conflict and the televised announcement of President Nixon stating that there needed to be another 150,000 soldiers sent to help in the efforts. On May 4th, the protesters gathered again. However, this time they were met with open gunfire from the National Guardsmen who had been convened by the governor of Ohio. The altercation on May 4th ended with 4 students dead and 9 wounded. The casualties of conflict in Vietnam are staggering. Those that lost their lives in battle or those who died related to injuries, death, by disease, or other ways that they were involved in the war reached over the millions, not just for U.S. troops, but for the North and South Vietnamese. There was life lost in the States as well, from protests and those that supported the conflicts. Casualties of suicide were noted to be from those who survived the war, but couldn't cope with the nightmares or treatment they received when they returned home. Construction in 1992 of the Vietnam Memorial pays tribute to those who sacrificed their life in combat during the Vietnam era. This 2-acre monument honors those troops whose services today are still a topic of controversy. Thousands of visitors pay tribute to these soldiers each year when visiting our nation's capital. With this amount of bloodshed, the years of combat, and the billions in funding provided by our government, it is without question that the Vietnam conflict, regardless of a congressional declaration, was by all means a war.